When we study history, we tend to draw these really strict borders around timelines and regions. We kind of just memorize events in total isolation. But in today's explainer, we are absolutely shattering those borders. We're going to zoom way out to look at two vastly different cultures, the Irish and the Jewish people, to uncover some truly fascinating hidden patterns in exactly how they survived immense pressure and displacement.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Typically, these two historical narratives are literally miles apart. Irish history is generally framed around colonialism, right? Land stolen, culture suppressed, and this really slow, agonizing fight to reclaim their identity. Jewish history, meanwhile, is defined largely by exile, a vast diaspora, severe persecution, and the persistent struggle to maintain identity across multiple continents. Because of those radically different contexts, they're almost always studied completely separately. But if you actually take a step back, striking patterns start to emerge. Now, to be perfectly clear right up front, these historical experiences are absolutely not identical. The specific details differ wildly. But by mapping them side by side, we uncover these profound shared structural realities of displacement and cultural survival that are honestly incredibly easy to overlook. Now, what's really fascinating about this is how it all starts with the foundation, which is the homeland. For both cultures, land was never just geography on a map. It was the absolute bedrock of their identity. In Ireland, the soil was inextricably tied to family, to language, and to history. And for the Jewish people, the connection to the land of Israel, which is anchored in tradition and memory, spans thousands of years. For both groups, it wasn't just a place to live. It was fundamentally who they were. So the crucial point is what actually happens when that deep connection is violently disrupted. In Ireland, over the course of centuries, control shifted as foreign powers came in and established authority. In Jewish history, that historical connection was repeatedly severed by waves of conquest and exile. Yet, and this is the amazing part, in both cases, the populations fiercely maintained their identity, even when physical and political control of their homeland was completely stripped away. So what actually drove them away? Well, in Ireland, the pressures were compounding and just relentless. We're talking massive land confiscations, crushing economic policies, and, tragically, the devastating famines of the 19th century. These incredible pressures pushed populations to the absolute brink, to a point where survival literally just meant leaving. Now compare that to the Jewish experience. The drivers of displacement here were distinctly different, yet equally devastating. Outright conquest, forced expulsion, and targeted persecution across all these different periods and empires. The specific contexts and the mechanisms differ dramatically, of course, but the massive scale of forced movement out of a historical homeland, that is a stark, defining parallel. And the structural outcome of all that forced movement was basically identical, a staggering global diaspora. Millions of Irish emigrated across the globe, just as the majority of the Jewish population found themselves dispersed across disparate countries and continents over incredibly long stretches of history. Both groups went from being deeply, deeply rooted in one single place to being scattered pretty much everywhere. So how do you even survive that kind of overwhelming dispersion? Well, through the active architecture of culture. Irish identities survived centuries of external control through the fierce preservation of language, music, and tradition. Jewish identity endured across countless languages and political systems through deep religious practice, cultural tradition, and a powerfully shared history. In both cases, they essentially made their culture portable. They kept their identities highly recognizable despite incredible distances and massive external pressures. And this brilliantly illustrates the core truth of both histories. Identity was not passive. It was actively maintained. We aren't talking about short, temporary hurdles here. We are talking about centuries for the Irish and millennia for the Jewish people. You do not survive that kind of prolonged pressure by accident. It requires intentional structure, deeply rooted community, and unyielding continuity. They didn't just happen to survive. They built resilient systems to ensure they survived. When you bring all of this together, the thematic overlaps are just impossible to ignore. A fierce connection to a homeland despite external control. A vast global diaspora born from forced movement. And the active, intentional preservation of identity under immense pressure. I really want to reiterate this. The granular details are different, for sure, but the structural realities are profound. They reveal exactly how both cultures have maintained their spirit over incredibly long periods of time. So, why does all this actually matter to us today? Because these patterns aren't just trapped in the past. They actively dictate modern views on land. They influence deeply held perspectives on identity, and they provide critical and often completely missing context to modern conflicts.
it really highlights the undeniable, sometimes invisible power of historical memory. Even if people aren't consciously aware of it, this memory heavily influences how groups respond to pressure today. Recognizing these shared patterns is absolutely essential for decoding our present.
Looking at these histories side by side really proves that while history doesn't always repeat, it certainly rhymes. But we've got to use these patterns to deepen our understanding, not oversimplify it. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question for our next explainer. How exactly does religion serve as the ultimate anchor for identity under pressure? And what can the missteps of empires, like the German colonial empire, teach us about the very real dangers of making falsely neat historical assumptions? We are going to dive into that fascinating puzzle next time. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you then.